Imagine waking up one morning knowing that the most dangerous fat in your body, the fat you cannot grab, the fat silently wrapping itself around your liver, your heart, your intestines, is finally responding. Not because you starved yourself, not because you lived at the gym, but because you understood precisely how this hidden fat operates biologically, and you use that understanding to activate the specific switches that dismantle it. Most people have never been told this, but visceral fat contains 3 to 4 times more cortisol receptor sites than any other fat depot in the body. That single fact explains more frustrated patients than almost anything else I encounter clinically. It explains why belly fat feels immovable despite dietary effort. It explains why it resists caloric restriction. It explains why it persists even when every other area of the body is responding to intervention. It is not a failure of discipline. It is the programming. Visceral fat was constructed by your body according to a specific set of biological instructions that make it resistant by design. But here is the clinical reality that changes everything. That same programming contains the opening. Once you activate the right metabolic switches, the right exercise stimulus, the right insulin rhythm, the right nutritional inputs, and one specific mineral, your body's own physiology becomes the mechanism of visceral fat clearance. Today I'm going to walk you through a complete biologically grounded strategy built from established mechanisms and peer-reviewed evidence. A plan specifically designed to reduce visceral fat while simultaneously lowering the cortisol environment that sustains it. Switch 1, the adrenaline signal. VO2 max training and the beta-3 adrenergic receptor. The first switch has nothing to do with caloric expenditure. It has everything to do with the type of signal you transmit to your fat tissue. Visceral fat is densely populated with beta-3 adrenergic receptors. These are essentially binding sites for adrenaline, catecholamine receptors that, when activated, trigger a lipolytic cascade that is substantially more powerful in visceral adipose tissue than in subcutaneous fat. When adrenaline binds to these receptors in sufficient concentration, it initiates the release of stored fatty acids from the visceral compartment specifically. The clinical question is how to generate that adrenaline signal in a controlled, sustainable way that your body can recover from, particularly relevant as we age and recovery capacity becomes a more significant variable. The answer is VO2 max training. VO2 max is your body's maximal oxygen utilization capacity during exercise, the ceiling of your aerobic engine. Research has established a consistent inverse relationship between VO2 max and visceral fat volume, independent of total body weight. Improving aerobic capacity makes your body meaningfully more efficient at mobilizing and oxidizing fat during the adrenaline-driven periods that high-intensity effort produces. The mechanism is precise. When you sustain effort in a higher intensity zone for several minutes, adrenaline rises and preferentially binds to those beta-3 receptors concentrated in abdominal adipose tissue. The fat cells respond by releasing fatty acids into the portal vein, the Rhine vein, the direct vascular highway from the visceral compartment to the liver. That proximity matters enormously. Those fatty acids reach the liver rapidly and are available for immediate oxidation. Your body is always optimizing for efficiency, and the visceral compartment, by anatomical virtue of its location, is the most efficiently accessed fuel reserve available. The specific protocol I recommend based on the evidence is the Norwegian 4-8-4 interval structure. Warm up adequately. Then perform 4 rounds of 4 minutes at approximately 85 to 90% of your maximum sustainable effort, with 3 minutes of easy active recovery between each interval. This can be executed on a stationary bike, a rowing ergometer, a treadmill, or even a sustained uphill walk for those for whom impact is a consideration. 3 sessions per week is sufficient. What this protocol achieves is a controlled, repeated adrenaline dose that activates beta-3 receptor signaling without producing the chronic cortisol elevation that excessive training volume generates. You are creating metabolic adaptation, not physiological exhaustion. That distinction is clinically critical in the over 60 population, where the recovery window is longer and the consequences of overtraining, cortisol elevation, muscle catabolism, immune suppression, are more significant than in younger patients. Switch 2, the insulin window. time-restricted eating and hormone-sensitive lipase activation. Even with adrenaline firing and beta-3 receptors activated, there is a second biological lock on visceral fat, and this one is governed entirely by insulin timing. Insulin is a storage hormone. Its primary function is to signal cells to absorb and store incoming glucose, and visceral adipocytes are exceptionally insulin sensitive. When insulin is elevated, the enzymatic machinery inside fat cells that breaks down stored triglycerides is actively suppressed. It does not matter how clean your dietary choices are in isolation. If insulin is chronically elevated through frequent eating, fat oxidation is functionally switched off. The enzyme at the center of this is hormone-sensitive lipase, HSL. Think of it as the crew inside each fat cell responsible for dismantling stored triglycerides into the mobile fatty acids that can exit the cell and enter circulation. HSL activity is directly suppressed by insulin and directly upregulated by its absence. When you extend the period between meals, when senpri pau and now pre and sumanpri and sunanpri and saranpris, when insulin falls, HSL becomes active and the fat cell begins releasing its contents. The complementary hormone is glucagon. As insulin declines during a fasting period, glucagon rises. Glucagon works in concert with adrenaline to amplify HSL activation. The fat cell begins mobilizing. And because visceral fat sits adjacent to the portal vein, those released fatty acids are immediately available to the liver, the fastest, most efficient fat utilization pathway in the body. In practical terms, the intervention is straightforward. Finish your last meal in the early evening, and routeren salmfiker and rousal for routsaltseri and brein around 7 or 8 o'clock. Do not eat again until late morning the following day, around 11 or noon. This is a 16-hour fasting window with an 8-hour eating window. For most people, this amounts to skipping breakfast, sleeping through the majority of the fast, and eating their first meal at late morning. The physiological adjustment period is typically 1 to 2 weeks, after which most patients report that morning hunger diminishes considerably and cognitive clarity during the fasted hours improves. During the fasting window, hydration is not only permitted, but important. Water, herbal tea, and black coffee are all appropriate. Electrolyte supplementation, specifically a formulation providing approximately 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium without sugar or artificial sweeteners, can meaningfully reduce the fatigue and appetite that some patients experience during fasting adaptation. It is not obligatory, but it is a tool worth having available. Switch 3 at the estrogen loop for C and Gertz region loop. Aromatase inhibition through dietary intervention. There is a third hormonal cycle driving visceral fat accumulation that most clinical discussions of belly fat never reach, and it involves the endocrine activity of fat tissue itself. Visceral fat is not metabolically passive. It is an active endocrine organ that produces hormones, and one of the most clinically significant is estrogen, generated through an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase converts androgens, primarily testosterone, into estrogen within the fat cell itself. The consequence is a self-amplifying loop. The more visceral fat present, the more aromatase activity, the higher the estrogen level, and the stronger the biological signal driving further fat storage in estrogen-sensitive compartments. Prening, quicker, and nauer enter. Primarily the abdominal region. This mechanism explains a pattern I see frequently in male patients in particular, stubborn central adiposity that persists despite reasonable diet and exercise, driven not by caloric excess, but by a locally generated hormonal environment that is actively promoting fat storage. The dietary intervention that directly addresses this loop is the regular consumption of cruciferous vegetables. Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and kale all contain a compound called indole-3 carbinol, which is converted during digestion to diindolyl methane, DIM. DIM supports hepatic estrogen metabolism, encouraging the production of 2-hydroxyestrone, the less biologically potent estrogen metabolite, while reducing 16-alpha-hydroxyestrone, the more potent and problematic form. 1 cup of steamed or roasted cruciferous vegetables every other day, ideally with the evening meal, provides sufficient indole-3 carbinol to meaningfully influence estrogen metabolism. This is not a supplement protocol. It is a straightforward dietary modification that works through your liver's existing detoxification pathways. For male patients dealing with particularly resistant central fat, Tongkat Ali, a plant extract that has been studied for its mild aromatase inhibiting properties and its effect on the testosterone to estrogen ratio, is a reasonable supplementary consideration. The evidence base is not definitive, but it is credible, and it is being referenced in legitimate research contexts. It is a tool, not a requirement. Switch 4, the cortisol factory. Breaking the local amplification loop with magnesium. Of all the mechanisms driving visceral fat persistence, this one is the most underappreciated and, in my view, the most important to understand clearly. We have established that visceral fat contains an unusually high density of cortisol receptors, but the biology goes further than receptor density. Visceral adipose tissue is enriched with an enzyme called 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1, 11-BHSD1. This enzyme performs a specific and clinically significant function. It converts inactive cortisone circulating in the bloodstream into active, potent cortisol, locally, within the fat cell itself. The implication is significant. Your visceral fat is not merely responding to systemic cortisol. It is generating its own localized cortisol environment, amplifying the stress signal within the abdominal compartment independent of what your adrenal glands are producing. Your belly fat is functioning as a cortisol factory, sustaining the hormonal environment that drives its own growth continuously, regardless of your subjective stress level. The intervention target is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system that governs cortisol production at the systemic level. When HPA axis activity is calmed, adrenal cortisol output decreases, and the 11-BHSD1 enzyme in visceral fat has less substrate to work with. You are starving the supply chain. The most evidence-supported nutritional intervention for HPA axis regulation is magnesium. Magnesium modulates the HPA axis through calcium channel antagonism and NMDA receptor regulation, producing a measurable dampening of the stress response at the neurological level. Magnesium deficiency, which is prevalent in adults over 50, partly due to reduced intestinal absorption and partly due to dietary insufficiency, is associated with elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep architecture, and increased inflammatory tone. My recommendation, 300 to 500 milligrams nightly of a highly bioavailable form. Magnesium glycinate, magnesium threonate, or magnesium malate are all appropriate choices. Take it before sleep, when it also supports the deeper slow-wave sleep stages during which growth hormone secretion and fat oxidation are most active. Paired with magnesium supplementation, 5 minutes of box breathing before sleep provides a complementary HPA axis intervention. 4 seconds inhale, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds exhale, 4 seconds hold, repeated for 5 minutes. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reduces sympathetic tone, and lowers baseline cortisol measurably. It is not a spiritual practice. It is a physiological tool with a documented mechanism. It costs nothing and requires no equipment. Switch 5, the hunger signal. Protein preloading and endogenous GLP-1 activation. Every intervention I've described can be undermined by one variable, uncontrolled appetite. And I want to address this directly because hunger is not a willpower problem. It is a neurohormonal one, and it has a specific clinically grounded solution. 20 to 30 minutes before your largest meal of the day, consume 25 to 30 grams of fast-digesting protein. Whey protein, egg whites, Greek yogurt, or cottage cheese are all appropriate sources. The macronutrient composition should be predominantly protein with minimal fat and carbohydrate. The mechanism is precisely understood. Dietary protein stimulates the intestinal release of incretin hormones, specifically GLP-1 and peptide YY. GLP-1 is the hormone pathway targeted by the current generation of injectable weight loss medications, which should tell you something about its physiological significance. Your body produces it naturally, in meaningful concentrations, in response to protein intake. GLP-1 slows gastric emptying, prolonging the physical sensation of fullness. Peptide YY travels to the hypothalamus and directly suppresses hunger signaling at the level of appetite regulation in the brain. Together, they produce satiety that is biochemical rather than behavioral. You are not white-knuckling through hunger on discipline alone. Your brain is receiving a genuine satiety signal. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition demonstrated that subjects using a protein preload before a meal consumed significantly fewer calories at that meal without conscious restriction and reported sustained fullness 3 to 4 hours longer than controls. The reduction in intake was not effortful, it was neurohormonal. This is the distinction between restriction and reprogramming. You are not eating less because you are forcing yourself to eat less. You are eating less because your brain's appetite circuitry is receiving an accurate satiety signal it was not previously receiving. The complete protocol. Let me consolidate this into a clear, actionable framework. 3 times per week, perform the Norwegian 4-4-4 interval protocol. Where malfarin sa wentrai asrai or trike yes were retorpor. 4 rounds of 4 minutes at 85 to 90% maximum effort, with 3 minutes of active recovery between rounds. You are activating beta-3 adrenergic receptors in visceral fat and generating the adrenaline signal that preferentially mobilizes deep abdominal fat. Daily or on most days, maintain a 16.8 fasting window. Finish your last meal by early evening and do not eat again until late morning. You are allowing insulin to fall sufficiently for hormone-sensitive lipase to activate and for glucagon to amplify the lipolytic signal in the visceral compartment. Every other day, include 1 cup of steamed or roasted cruciferous vegetables with your evening meal. You are providing the indole-3 carbonyl substrate your liver needs to metabolize estrogen through the less potent pathway, interrupting the aromatase-driven fat storage loop. Every evening, take 300 to 500 milligrams of bioavailable magnesium and spend 5 minutes in box breathing before sleep. You are down-regulating HPA axis activity, reducing the substrate available to the 11-VHSD1 enzyme in visceral fat, and supporting the sleep architecture during which fat oxidation is most productive. Before your largest meal each day, consume 25 to 30 grams of fast-digesting protein 20 to 30 minutes in advance. You are activating endogenous GLP-1 and peptide YY, producing genuine neurohormonal satiety that makes appropriate caloric intake sustainable rather than effortful. What this represents clinically: this is not a caloric restriction protocol. It is not a punishment regimen. It is a 30-day biological recalibration of how your body identifies, mobilizes, and oxidizes visceral fat, using the mechanisms your physiology already possesses, targeted in the sequence and manner that the evidence supports. For patients over 60, this framework is particularly relevant because each component respects the physiological realities of aging, recovery capacity, hormonal shifts, reduced magnesium absorption, the altered insulin sensitivity that comes with sarcopenic change, and the increasing importance of sustainable rather than aggressive intervention. You are not working against your biology. You are working with it precisely, systematically, and based on what the mechanisms actually are rather than what the wellness industry has simplified them to. The fat that has resisted everything else was not resistant because of a character deficiency. It was resistant because no one gave you the complete biological picture. Now you have it.